Hello, everyone, and welcome to MAP Forum. I'm Negar Rokar, and I have the pleasure of hosting the weekly webinars for the Medici Archive project. Today, I am delighted to welcome Professor Philippe Canguilhem, who is a professor of musicology at the University of Toul, who is also connecting from France. So it's 11 p.m. there. Good evening, Professor Canguilhem. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. We can't wait to hear all about your very recent publication. It's a book talk that was published in 2024. So it's almost fresh out of the oven. And so we can't wait. All the screen is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Medici Archive project for inviting me. I'm very happy to be among you, and thank you to all the team and to Alessio Assonitis, the director. So I would like to take advantage to this talk to present a part of my work I have published recently in a book that have been long in the making, because it has been like 25 years of work about the musical life in Florence between 1530 and 1570. So roughly between the two first Medici dukes, Alessandro and Cosimo. The history of Florence in this period is very, very well known, of course, and has been heavily and deeply studied, especially history, but also art, of course, literature, and music not that much, I have to say. There are many reasons that explain that there was like a lack of interest in musical life in Florence during those decades, because they are framed before this period and after this period by two very rich musical periods. Before that, the end of the 15th century, around Lorenzo il Magnifico, you have a very rich musical life. And after, at the end of the 16th century, of course, you have the birth of the opera. So between those two high points, there was thought by musicology that there were like a dearth a little bit. And so what I've been doing is not really a history of music in Florence during those years, but a history of Florentine culture viewed through the lens of music. The idea is to use music as, say, a gateway to investigate the evolution of the Florentine society in 40 years between 1530 and 1570, with this decisive shift in the political and cultural structures of the city. So before I start my say official talk, and I will explain you what I will do, I would like just to, because I'm sorry for that, I am French and I wrote my book in French. So just to give you an idea, a very brief overview of I will share my screen, sorry. A very brief overview of the book. Yes, here you have the first slide, but that which is entitled À l'ombre du laurier, in the shade of the laurel. The laurel is, of course, the tree symbolic of the Medici, music and culture in Florence. So my book follows a chronological path, and I have three parts: the 1530s, 1540s, and 15s and 60s. So I start with the Florentines in Rome, because I have noticed that most of the Florentine patrons for for not only musical but also cultural life are living in Rome. So there is this strong connection between the two cities. Of course, there is at the first part of the 30s, there is a Medici Pope, also Clemens VII in Rome. And I observe the academic life in Rome, basically with the which is done by the Florentine. And then I move to Florence to observe Duke Alessandro's court and music at his court. It is like paradoxical because we have very few documents, very few sources about Duke Alessandro's Florence, but at the same time, as far as music is concerned, there is a wonderful blooming of the polyphonic madrigal. So we have to explain a little bit the context in which this madrigal occurs. And this is the second chapter. Then I go to an analysis of the musical pieces that are related with politics, with Florentine politics in the 1530s. We have many, many pieces that reflect the tensions of the 30s through music, and I try to illuminate the relationship between music and politics in those years. And then I go to the Cosimo period with the 1540s when he tries to stabilize his reign with the classical chapter number 4 on music and musicians at his court, where I try to explain, for instance, how he reinstalled the music chapel and why he did that, and which repertoire they would sing at Santa Maria del Fiore under his reign. And then I go, and this is the bigger chapter in my book, the number 5, because I observe the role of music within the Accademia Fiorentina, because there are many interesting writings and discussions about music in the Accademia Fiorentina that had been overlooked so far, and also outside among rich merchants or other meetings, musical meetings by members of the Accademia, but that are not held during the official sessions of the Accademia. And to finish with, I go to the last 20 years, the 50s and the 60s. So I stop in 70 because in 70, the mutation, political mutation is over. I mean, he becomes Grand Duke at that period. And the 20 years, the 50s and the 60s, I observe how the duchy and how this political agenda uses music to reach its goals. First with the music for festivals and the turn from the popular canti carnascialeschi to the more courtly mascherate. And the last chapter is about the concept of Florentine nobility, a concept that would be completely alien to those Florentines of the 1530s, 40 years before. It was impossible for the Florentine merchants to dream of being aristocrats and nobles. But all the political context has changed at that period in the 60s. And I observe this, and especially how the music practice develops around the children of Cosimo. Not only his son Francesco, but also the others, Isabella, of course, who was a great musician, apparently, and also the very young Ferdinando, who would become a cardinal. So this is it, and now what I would like to do is a formal paper I will read, which is part of my introduction, actually. And to start my book, I thought it could have been interesting to offer a reading of a famous painting. This painting, a portrait. In my mind, I think the reading I will offer explains what I am trying to do in all my book. I have been trying to understand the sources. So here is not a music source, it is a portrait, a painting, but also the literary, the iconographical and the musical sources. I have been trying to read them in their proper context. So I start, and this portrait attributed to Bronzino on stylistic grounds, it is chronologically the first of a series that Bronzino depicted for Cosimo and his family. But compared to the others, this one stands apart as the painter chose to represent the Duke as Orpheus, holding a lira d'abbraccio in front of Cerberus. With these elements at hand, art historians have interpreted this allegory as meaningful in two ways. The first is political. Representing Cosimo as Orpheus after his song has calmed down Cerberus should be seen as reflecting the new political order that was emerging in the first years of his reign. His victory at the Battle of Montemurlo on August 1st, 1537, had definitely ruined the hopes of the Florentine exiles, the fuoriusciti, to reinstall a republican government and get rid of Medici rule. To strengthen their argument, commentators point out the fact that 20 years earlier, Baccio Bandinelli had already sculpted an Orfeo for Pope Leo X, il quale col suono e canto placa Cerbero e muove l'inferno a pietà, according to the words of Giorgio Vasari. And despite the fact that no political reading of both the Bandinelli and the Bronzino Orpheus has survived from contemporary witnesses, the evidence accumulated by art historians over a long period is sufficiently convincing to be widely accepted today. The second interpretation of this portrait does not prompt a similar unanimity. It contends that the painting was conceived as a wedding gift for Cosimo's bride, Eleonora di Toledo, whom he married in the summer of 1539. As Karl Strehlke summarizes, I quote him, "While there is no documentation for this, the picture has been accepted in much art historical literature as a marriage portrait," end quote. Much, but not all, art historical literature accept this claim. For Elizabeth Cropper, the arguments in favor of this interpretation, I quote, remain unconvincing. The Orpheus story, despite medieval retellings in which Eurydice escapes from the underworld instead of falling back forever when Orpheus turns to look at her, would not at first sight bode well for a marriage. Well, to this I can react as a music historian. In fact, when 60 years later, the Florentine courtier Jacopo Corsi presented a musical gift to Maria de' Medici for the ceremonies surrounding her wedding to Henry IV, King of France, in October 1600, he asked the poet Ottavio Rinuccini to write a libretto inspired by the story of Orfeo, and then asked the court musician Jacopo Peri to set it to music. The resulting musical work, L'Euridice, is considered today to be the first opera ever composed that is still extant. In the minds of late 16th century Florentines, then, it seems that Orfeo was perfectly suitable for a wedding present, provided that the story be modified to finish with a happy ending, of course. But it is not the case, I come back to the painting. It is not because Orfeo was intended as a wedding present in 1600 that we can be sure that such was the case for the present portrait. And Cropper is right to ask for some caution, even if she has noticed, as every other critic. I quote, the excited eroticism of Bronzino's portrait, to which I shall turn towards the end of my talk. Before that, I would like to explore the political implications of Cosimo as Orpheus, as they could have been understood by a Florentine spectator of the time. To do this, we will follow the interpretation of the Orpheus myth as given by a key member of the Accademia Fiorentina, and we will discover which tradition he was following. We will then try to understand the function of the lira d'abbraccio in the painting, and we will see how it cleverly allows the painter to reinforce the legitimacy of the young duke as the new ruler of Florence. Finally, we will look into Bronzino's own intellectual biography to find some keys to another interpretation, one that departs from political allegory and allows us to discover another possible reading of this painting. To understand the double political allegory displayed in the portraits, we have to bear in mind some basic facts concerning the fragile situation of Cosimo at the beginning of his reign. And first of all, an institutional fragility. The new ducal regime had been imposed a few years before, after the besieging of the city in 1530, and his predecessor, Alessandro, had provoked strong hostility both within and outside Florence. Only 2 years after the beginning of his official reign, Alessandro, the first Duke of Florence, had achieved to arouse the hatred of all Republican exiles, the fuoriusciti, despite their deep internal differences of opinion about the type of regime that should be established. To this external hostility was added opposition to Alessandro within Florence itself, as a number of citizens protested the brutality of his rule. His own cousin, Lorenzino, stabbed him to death in early January 1537. Anxious about a possible Republican riot, the senators had hurried to elect the 17-year-old Cosimo as Alessandro's successor. The young duke had inherited a particularly unstable political situation, and if 2 years afterwards, when Bronzino is supposed to have made this portrait, Cosimo was obviously in a better position than at the time of his election, he still had to project the reassuring image of a victorious prince and a peacemaker one. Likening Cosimo with Orpheus did not render his struggle against the fuoriusciti soft and peaceful, however. If we push the metaphor until the very end, his opponents are figured as savage beasts or as Cerberus, the many-headed monster. Making them silent and obedient constituted a challenge that Cosimo would face for most of his reign. To understand why such a reading is perfectly possible for this portrait, we need to know how Orpheus was perceived in Florence at that period. In fact, we can observe a Florentine tradition of interpretation, which relies more on Horace than on Ovid or Virgil, who both only allude to Orpheus' capacity to charm animals and plants. Horace, Ars Poetica, on the other hand, evokes Orpheus only in passing, but points out a very peculiar feature that is not found among the other Roman sources. I quote Horace: Orpheus, the priest and interpreter of the gods, deterred the savage race of men from slaughters and inhuman diet. Hence, he was said to tame tigers and furious lions. His civilizing Orpheus and his analogy between savage men and wild beasts was in turn taken over by Dante in his Convivio, who chose precisely the story of Orpheus as an example to illustrate the concept of allegory. I quote Dante in his definition of allegory. He says, a truth concealed beneath a beautiful lie, a beautiful definition. And I will put my quotations in original Italian, but I translate them into English when I speak. So Dante says about Orpheus and about the concept of allegory, so a truth concealed beneath a beautiful lie, as when Ovid says that Orpheus calmed the beasts with his lyre and made the trees and the rocks move toward him, which means that the wise man, with the instrument of his voice, makes cruel hearts mild and humble, and moves at will those who have no life of knowledge and art. And those who have no rational life are more or less like stones. To my very limited knowledge, Dante is the first author to offer such an allegorical interpretation of this aspect of the tale of Orpheus. In Florence, Dante was followed soon afterwards by Giovanni Boccaccio in his Genealogia Deorum, and in the 15th century by Cristoforo Landino, who quoted him extensively. And Landino goes on saying what the poets wanted to say when they claimed that Orpheus could calm the beasts with his lyre, make the trees and the rocks move toward him, and stop the rivers flowing, was simply this, that he could, with his sweet discourse, subjugate men into leading a courteous and civil life, whereas before them they had been alien to virtues and almost like stones, and completely driven by sensual pleasures. Dante, Boccaccio, and Landino indicate the strong Florentine background of the political allegory, and we can be sure that Dante and Landino were still read at the time of Bronzino's portrait, as we have preserved a very eloquent version of this same interpretation written in Florence a few years after Bronzino's execution of the portrait, a version that clearly draws on Dante and Landino. I quote, "The ancients imagined that Orpheus could stop the wildest beasts. That is to say, he took away from wild and presumptuous men their wildness and presumptuousness, and made them humble and docile. And for the same reason, they imagined that he stopped the rivers flowing, meaning that he halted the overflowing course of minds that precipitously chased after their own desires and appetites without any restraint. And in the same way, they say that he moved the plants, that is, he took away the obscenities from the hardened minds of men and reduced them to a state in which they would listen to his harmony." The author of these lines was to become one of the most important members of the court of Cosimo I. As a key member also of the Accademia Fiorentina, Cosimo Bartoli was particularly interested in artistic matters. Connoisseur and practitioner in architecture, he would translate and publish Leon Battista Alberti's treatise on the subject, and we know that he played a decisive role in the genesis of Giorgio Vasari's Vite. In fact, Vasari relied extensively on Bartoli to write the theoretical texts that appear at the beginning of the different sections of his book. Bartoli's explanation of the Orpheus tale is taken from one of the 3 dialogues on the arts that introduced the academic lectures on Dante he read in the 1540s, which were eventually published later, as you can see, in 1567. The dialogues are devoted to architecture and sculpture, to painting and music. When reading his second dialogue on painting, as well as other descriptions of paintings that are distributed throughout the treatise, one is struck by the privileged and even almost exclusive position occupied by the iconographical program, the invenzione, among the discussions about painting that took place among Florentine connoisseurs, who were apparently less concerned by formal realization of the works they discuss. More than design or color, it is the iconographical program that forms the soul of painting and constitutes the core of Bartoli's discourse. Bartoli is known to have himself conceived a number of these pictorial inventions, which he calls capricci in his treatise. Some of them intended for Vasari. In the course of his descriptions, Bartoli added some rubrics in the margin of the pages, intended as guides for the reader to help him to grasp the main ideas of his capricci. His lines on Orpheus, though not directly related to any pictorial description, contain similar rubrics, here highlighted in yellow, that allow the reader to understand the meaning of any picture containing an Orfeo taming wild beasts. At the same time, the rubrics offer an iconographical description that could have been reused by any artist. And we know that Bronzino himself used one of Bartoli's capricci situated in the third ragionamento of his book to depict his allegory of happiness now held at the Uffizi in Florence. To what extent could Bartoli's interpretation on Orpheus have helped Bronzino or Cosimo to conceptualize our painting? Or was it perhaps the other way round? That is, could Bartoli's lines describe Cosimo's portrait as well as Bandinelli's sculpture? While it is hard to give a definitive answer to these questions, Bartoli's interpretation of an Orpheus, I quote, taking away the obstinacies from the hardened minds or wild and presumptuous men, allows for a political reading of the painting, which illustrates the Medician restoration in the most eloquent way. Being made silent and obedient, listening peaceably to the words of the prince, Florentine citizens will abandon any ambition to reconquer the city. As I have said earlier, there is a double political allegory at work in this painting. To understand why, we have to concentrate our attention not on Cosimo, but rather on Orfeo. How do we know he is Orpheus? There are a few signs that help to identify him. Cerberus is one of them, of course. But the object that attracts the eye is the lyre, the indispensable attribute of the singer. And through the lyre, here depicted as a contemporary lira da braccio, the Florentine spectator could access a second layer of political meaning. By concluding his interpretation of Orpheus Smith with a reference to armonia, Bartoli was alluding, as a true Florentine, to its Platonic sense, to which he would turn back a few lines later. Music has to be praised, says Bartoli, insofar as it maintains and governs the machine of the world. Because if the harmony of the 7 planets and of the other celestial spheres, which maintain the order of the world, is lost, we know for sure that the machine of the universe would fall apart and disappear. For Bronzino, as for Renaissance writers and artists more generally, the 7 strings of the lira da braccio corresponded to the 7 planets, and the harmony they produced transposed the harmony of the universe into the sensible world. This Platonic concept had been of great importance in Florence since the time it had been studied by Marsilio Ficino. We know how Ficino was fascinated by the figure of Orpheus. He was famous for singing Orphic hymns with his lyre, and we know that Ficino's instrument, a lira da braccio, had been preserved in Florence per memoria, for memory, until at least the very end of the 16th century. Ficino, moreover, was a very meaningful philosophical and cultural reference for all contemporaries of Bronzino and Cosimo. Even more than his philosophy, it was the cultural and historical background that he embodied that attracted a generation obsessed with the golden age of Lorenzo il Magnifico. Putting a lira in the hands of Cosimo as Orpheus, then, would provoke an association of ideas that, through the Ficinian reference, would connect the young duke with the other Cosimo, the pater patriae, who symbolized at the same time a blessed period for the arts and culture and an age of economical prosperity and political peace. Orpheus' lyre authorizes, thanks to Ficino's evocation, the linking of the young Cosimo and his still fragile authority to the reassuring and powerful figure of his most famous ancestor. This transfer from one Cosimo to the other through the mediation of Ficino would be explicitly acknowledged a few years later, after the execution of the portrait, by no other than, again, Cosimo Bartoli. In the dedicatory letter of his Italian translation of Ficino's commentary on the banquet, issued in 1544, and addressed to the Duke, Bartoli evokes in the very first sentence, I quote, "Our Marsilio Ficino, worthy pupil of the great Cosimo, from whom your Excellency took his very name, so that his illustrious memory could be preserved." Invoking a relationship with the Golden Age was certainly a means to secure political advantages, but there was also a much more pragmatic reason for Duke Cosimo to inscribe his personal image within the Medicean continuity. Everyone was aware of Cosimo's personal history, that of a fatherless youngster belonging to a secondary branch of the family, penniless, without strong political or economical support, brought up away from his cousins, who were the direct heirs of Cosimo il Vecchio, and who could be assured, his cousins, of a brilliant future. Nobody had forgotten how the young Cosimo had been chosen by default by the senators a few months before, in order to avoid a regency of Cardinal Cibo. Cosimo was then very eager to demonstrate all the links that united him to his glorious ancestors in order to consolidate his position, a position that endured a double weakness. As he was struggling to build a political legitimacy, the young duke was also facing a problem of dynastic legitimacy. And this is why the lira da braccio plays such a crucial role in the painting, not only because it reminds Ficino and through him Cosimo il Vecchio, but also because this very instrument was also played by Lorenzo il Magnifico himself and his father Piero. Why then, given its importance, did Bronzino decide to represent it in reverse? Of course, the sounds of the lira are addressed to Cerberus, and it seems logical that the strings and the sounding board be orientated in its direction. But I would like to suggest that this is not what the Florentine observers of the time would have noticed. Rather, they would have noticed that by means of this backward orientation, Bronzino is able to display the reverse of the peg box, which reveals the Medici coat of arms, the famous palle. While it is true that the number of balls had been reduced to 6 at the time of Duke Cosimo, the Medici coat of arms displayed a varied number of besants along the centuries. And guarda caso, there are 7 palle on the personal coat of arms of Cosimo il Vecchio, as appears in the facade of the courtyard of Palazzo Medici built by Michelozzo. Look at how the arrangement of the pegs and the form of the peg box, similar to a reversed scudo, are strongly reminiscent of the Medici coat of arms. In a first version of the painting that was revealed through an analysis by infrared reflectography and X-radiography, the peg box even more clearly adopts the form of a shield, so typical of the Medici heraldic device. And last but not least, turning once again in the courtyard of Palazzo Medici, it is maybe no coincidence that Bandinelli's sculpture is positioned just below the coat of arms, as if Bronzino and the young Duke had noticed their proximity and wanted to represent it even more explicitly. The complex interplay of references and allusions that take place in Bronzino's portrait is further multiplied by the recognition that the Ficinian harmony of the 7 planets and celestial spheres reflects itself in the very name of the two Cosimo. Cosmo, Cosimo, the encomiastic poetry that would soon bloom at the ducal court is saturated by puns and word plays on the double meaning of the duke's name, represented here by Bronzino as embodying the musical order of the world. The double political reading I have proposed here departs from a number of earlier interpretations that see Bronzino's portrait as concerned, I quote, more by the conjugal life of the Duke than by his political projects, to put it in the words of Maurice Brock. Following Robert Simon, and I go back to the portrait, critics have been attracted by the suggestive posture of Cosimo that is so conspicuous, hence their judgment. The work is suggestively erotic, Janet Cox-Ririck writes, with the shapes of the bow and the pegbox of the lira da braccio that Cosimo Orpheus holds, suggesting male and female sex organs, and his grasp of the bow emphasizing its phallic shape and placement. End quote. Well, we have suddenly moved from the celestial harmony to somewhat rather more earthly subjects. Indeed, this aspect of the portrait is not difficult to understand, and it functions in such a way that one suspects that Bronzino did not want to hide his message. Whereas the politico-dynastic allegory needs some explanation, the formal language of the painting, the Duke's attitude, the form of his instrument, the placement of the bow, and the way he holds it, facilitates the access to its erotic message. So, what? Is it really what Bronzino and the Duke wanted us to see? Or is it possible that on this matter, too, another reading can be made, one that would be reserved to those who could distinguish not only the clear formal language of the portrait, like all of us, but also something else? As a matter of fact, it is my belief that Bronzino, through the erotic attitude that is so obvious, wanted to drive his fellow Florentines towards another interpretation. Let us try in closing to understand how it could have worked. In order to decipher the erotic code used in the portrait, we have to remember that next to his artistic skills, Bronzino was also a poet, known today to have left a canzoniere containing 265 poems, most of them being sonnets that follow the Petrarchan model. Perfectly inserted in the Florentine literary milieu, he would be elected to the Accademia Fiorentina in 1541. At the time of the portrait, Bronzino was a member of an informal group of friends who gathered around Benedetto Varchi and other literary and artistic figures of the 1530s, like Luca Martini or the sculptor Tribolo. In a letter addressed to Tribolo and to Bronzino in 1539, Varchi singles out that both artists, I quote Varchi, enjoy and understand poetic matters, especially Bronzino, who has memorized the whole of Dante and a great part of Petrarch, far beyond what would perhaps seem credible to people who do not understand that just as poetry is nothing other than a speaking picture, so painting is nothing other than a mute poetry. This rather affirmative ut pictura poesis justifies and reinforces the unity of Bronzino's artistic endeavor, as well as it allows us to confront his poetry with his painting. In following this path, however, I will not consider his Petrarchan sonnets, but rather another part of his poetic output, a part that was praised by Giorgio Vasari, who alludes to Bronzino's, I quote Vasari, marvelous talent in the style of his capitoli after the manner of Berni, insomuch that at the present day there is no one who writes better that kind of verse, nor things more bizarre and capricious. The bizarre and capricious poetry to which Vasari refers was called burlesca or in burla, and the capitoli written by Francesco Berni and his followers constitute a cultural product that was eminently Florentine. Berni had built upon a local tradition that was created by the poet Burchiello in the first half of the 15th century, and then kept alive notably by the authors of carnival songs, who all used a coded language that transformed innocent trade songs into obscene and scabrous tales. All this poetry is linguistically equivocal in that, under the surface of the ordinary meaning, it offers sexual allusions that can be understood only by those who share the code with the poet. The fact that the concealed meaning of the ordinary vocabulary employed by these poets pertained to an exclusively Florentine tradition has been expressed by Benedetto Varchi, who notes, I quote him, that I strongly hold the view that he who was not born in Florence, or at least who has not lived there for a long time, cannot become excellent in this genre. Let us come back to Orpheus once again. For Bronzino the poet, so talented in the style of his capitoli, and for his fellows Florentines, any of the various elements presented in the portrait could refer to a vocabulary that was present in the burlesque poetry, burlesca. And if, following Varchi, painting is nothing other than mute poetry, the observers could directly translate into words what they were seeing. Helped by the masterful work of Jean Toscan, who revealed in his Carnaval du langage of 1975 the second meaning of the vocabulary used in burlesque poetry, let us discover what the Florentines were able to see in Bronzino's painting. Jean Toscan reminds us firstly that the metaphor is the most simple and easiest means of substituting the meaning of a word for another. So, the bird or fish, anguilla, uccello, means the penis by similarity of form. Likewise, the shoes, scarpa, stivale, or clothes, gonna, veste, evoke the female sex by similarity of function. Here in the painting, the bow, archetto, can be understood as a substitute for penis by similarity of action, forward and backwards. But beyond metaphor, burlesque poets also used more subtle techniques to reach their goals. Let us take one example, the word cantare, to sing, a crucial word when evoking Orpheus. In Italian, the first meaning of canto is the song, but it is also used as side, as in accanto, or in the expression dall'altro canto, on the other side. Hence, canto holds the meaning of anus in the burlesque poetry, and cantare is used as a synonym for practicing sodomy. As we progress into the cryptic world of Bronzino's poetic references, we discover that his painting, far from being only suggestively erotic, as critics have noticed, is in fact much more obscene than they imagined. Orfeo has been cited in the burlesque repertoire, most notably in the following line of a sonnet by Burchiello that says, Orfeo insegnò cantare ai grilli. Orpheus taught the art of singing to the crickets. If the first meaning of the verse is perfectly coherent, as it reminds us of Orpheus' power to charm animals, the equivocal meaning of this sentence casts a very different light on the singer. Now that we know that the verb cantare means, we have still to understand what the crickets signify to be able to appreciate the double entendre. Grillo was used as a substitute for penis, and this metaphor was so widespread that it formed the topic of a number of poems in the 15th and 16th century Italy, two of which were even set to music. One is the famous El Grillo by Josquin des Prés. The other one, a madrigal entitled Leggiadre Rime, circulated in Florence at the time of the portrait, as it had been composed by Philippe Verdelot in the city, the most important musician in Florence during the 1520s. The end of this song, which evokes the happy life and sweet death of the cricket, is so easy to decipher that it does not necessitate any particular comment, and I will restrain from quoting and from reading. You can read it on the screen, of course. More generally, burlesque poetry is full of musical scenes using string instruments, viols, lutes, or lire da braccio. My last example will be taken from a carnival song written in Florence by Guglielmo detto il Giuggiola in the first decades of the 16th century. The Canto di Lanzi Mastri Sonatori di Ribecchini. So here the Lanzi, with their strong German accent, sing this strophe. I translate it. In order to make bright and beautiful sounds, when the strings are relaxed, you have to touch these pegs that are pushed inside. And when you have them tuned right, you feel more sweetness in the end. As soon as we learn in Jean Toscan's glossary that suono was used for sexual relationship and that accordare, or tuning a string, refers to having an erection, these lines become easily understandable, even more so because the word bischero, peg, still means penis in Tuscany today. And thus, it is with the pegs and their double meaning that the two allegorical levels of the portrait finally merge. In fact, the equivocal and burlesque reading of Bronzino's work does not cancel the political allegory at all. Rather, identifying the pegs of the lira d'abbraccio, both with the Medici palle and the sexual meaning of bischeri, reinforces the design of the portrait. As a matter of fact, I would like to suggest that the peg box conveys a message of dynastic fecundity, a promise of a brilliant future for the Medici family. In a sense, then, it could well have been used as a wedding present, even though its provenance has apparently nothing to do with the ducal collection, and it rather may be related to a private Florentine family, as suggested by Strelke. At any rate, it seems clear that the painting, with its political and erotic allusions, was intended for a Florentine audience and was made to speak to strong supporters of the Medici who were well aware of local cultural habits rather than to appeal to a Neapolitan Spanish-speaking young princess. In an attempt to understand the function of the double entendre in Florentine burlesque poetry, Jean Toscan has noticed that, I quote him, the shared plays on words and language contribute to the affirmation of the cohesive community and to help it to assign its own place among others. End quote. Following this assumption, we can interpret this portrait as having the function of strengthening the ties between the painter, the sitter, and the spectators, thanks to their common belonging to what Bruce Smith has called a speech community. For Bruce Smith, I quote him, the speech community also constitutes an acoustic community. Its identity is maintained not only by what its members say in common, but what they hear in common, end quote. And I should add also but what they sing and play in common. And here is the point of departure of my inquiries and of my book. If, as Bruce Smith has observed, studying songs is relevant as they help to confirm a speech community's identity, then the study of musical practice and culture in a particular place and time, in my case, in Florence at the time of Cosimo I, can cast some light on a community that has been observed so far only through images and texts. By trying to investigate the oral culture of 16th century Florence, I hope to add a modest contribution to the understanding of a world that, despite being deeply studied, still deserved further research. Thank you for your attention.
Fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing your research with us. I truly enjoyed it. We do have about 6 minutes and 3 questions. So if you could keep your answers brief. We have 4 questions. Okay, so the first question is by Polly. Thank you for this illuminating lecture, and I second that. Could you comment on the signature in, I assume, Bronzino's portrait?
The signature, I don't see a signature in the portrait. I think it has been attributed to Bronzino on mainly on stylistic grounds. I have to say I am not art historian. I have read what has been written on the portrait, of course, but I don't see. There is no, for the best of my knowledge, and there is no signature in this portrait. So
Okay, so the next question is by Elizabeth Fama. The radiograph of the Orpheus painting seemed to show a shoulder strap with an ornate buckle. Do you see any symbolism in the buckle?
Oh, I think some art historians have spoken about this. I don't remember exactly, but in Robert Simon's study, you will find something about that because he's in his study he publishes this X radiography. So there is something, but it is I don't remember that it would modify deeply my reading or another reading. As you can see also, you have Cerberus has many heads, not only one. So there were some modifications. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question from Federico. In the course of my research, and I'm quoting Federico, in the course of my research on Florentine exiles, I have repeatedly come across references to an informal musical academy hosted at the Roman residence of Bino Altoviti. Is there any reliable information on documentation about this circle?
Yes, Federico, you can read my first chapter. I have a few pages on the Accademia degli Amici. Actually, I did not. You will see. I elaborate some hypotheses about who was part of this academy, and most importantly, I have found that this academy did exist. Actually, it is quoted by someone so as existing. So and I have a study part of my chapter 1. So yes, there are some things to say about that.
Okay, and Elizabeth has a follow-up question. As other scholars have pointed out, the painting looks like it's referencing the Belvedere torso. To me, it has always seemed that Cosimo's head was added later to a pre-existing painting. That observation doesn't negate your theories, of course, but does make the artistic decision-making feel exposed.
Yes, thank you. It's a great suggestion. Yes, it looks like if we think that the head has been added afterwards, it can make sense because it looks that it is not entirely natural, and so why not? I am not a specialist in art history and in painting, in early painting, but this is a great suggestion, and so maybe it was someone else. Absolutely. Yeah.
Right. And Polly also, I assume this is again another art historical question, but on the significance of the animal next to the instrument.
So it's Cerberus, the multiple-headed dog of the hell, who is guarding the hell. So there are two versions, as we can see. First, there were his multiple heads were shown, but in the final version, there is only one, as far as we can see. Yeah.
Great. We only have two minutes. So Emily asks, thank you. This was wonderful. Could you comment at all on Cosimo's actual musicianship, whether he was trained, whether you see traces of his musicality in the archives or not?
Yes. He was not maybe completely taken with music as other rulers of 16th century Italy, notably in Ferrara d'Este or in Mantova de Gonzaga. So that he was interested in music. We have many anecdotes about his interest in music, his personal interest in music. We know that he was brought up with singing. I mean, he knew how to sing, and he delighted to sing in company. So music was part of his direct environment for sure. Again, in my fourth chapter, I have brought together all what I have been able to find about this musical practice and Cosimo. Yeah.
Right. Kate asks, isn't it a lyre or his strap?
I don't have the question. Sorry.
Do you have the questions? You
No.
can actually see the questions in the Q&A, but
Oh, sorry.
she's asking, Kate is asking if this is the musical instrument on his strap.
On the musical instrument, sorry, I have to look at the questions. Wait a second. I'm here. Q&R.
In the Q&A box.
Yes.
Yeah, if you click on that. So scroll down to Kate Bolton.
Yes. On his strap. Isn't it a lyre on his strap? I don't think so. It is no. It is a lira da braccio. So he's holding it in a particular way, of course. But it is a no. It is an ordinary lira da braccio, a big one, actually. Yes. But we have preserved original instruments from the 16th century. Particularly a fantastic instrument in Vienna, beautiful one.
Wonderful. And Elizabeth asks, at what date was Bandinelli's sculpture installed in the courtyard?
This, well, this I don't know exactly, but it was done for Leo X, so I guess it was during Restoration. Like 20 years before the portrait. Bronzino's portrait was painted. This is my guess, but if the sculpture was installed directly after it had been made, because it was commissioned by Leo X. So more than that, I cannot say. I'm sorry.
Okay,
I shouldn't have given this talk because again I am really weak on art historical issues, and I am sorry for that.
No worries at all. That's not your specialty, so don't worry. We have time for one more question, and I'm happy to forward any follow-up questions to Professor Canguilhem. So please email me or Professor Canguilhem directly if you have any follow-up questions. So this is the last question by George. Bronzino also quotes Michelangelo's Eve in the temptation scene of the Sistine ceiling, another gender reference to this.
Oh, interesting.
Do you have any comments?
Yes, I was not aware, but it's interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Canguilhem. I know it's midnight for you and for all of our audience in Europe. So thank you so much for joining us today. That was a beautiful presentation and a fascinating topic. I'm so happy that we could actually make this happen.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much. And thank you for all those who have listened. Yeah.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We will see you next week, same time, same link, still 11 p.m. Central European time. So we're back to our normal time. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Have a good evening. Bye.
Bye.